Welcome to Yes and Land, where we say yes to the reality of what you're facing, and we say and to the possibility, joy, and new chapters still ahead. Today, I want to spend some time with a book that does exactly that. The Ride of a Lifetime is part memoir, part leadership reflection, and part case study in how organizations rise, fall, and sometimes find their way back. In it, Bob Iger reflects on decades inside the Walt Disney Company, including some of its most turbulent years in recent memory. He doesn't just recount what happened. He distills those experiences into 10 guiding principles for leadership. I won't walk through all 10 today. This is a book worth reading for that alone. I do want to focus on a few principles that come alive most clearly through his decisions and experiences that reshaped Disney, because they speak directly to what Yes and Land is about. What it looks like to say yes to what's breaking, and to say and to the hope of building for a better future. There was no single moment when Disney stopped working. What changed first was what it felt like inside the company. By the early 2000s, Disney was under real strain. The extraordinarily creative run of the early 1990s of hits like Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King had faded. Disney Animation Studios struggled to consistently produce hits and had a number of box office flops. Key relationships were deteriorating. The board was uneasy and shareholders were restless. Financially, Disney was still large and powerful, but strategically it was losing momentum. And internally, trust was thinning. At the center of all of this and of this company was Michael Eisner. Now, Eisner had once been the architect of Disney's resurgence. Under his leadership, the company reclaimed cultural relevance and commercial success. But over time, his leadership narrowed. He attempted to centralize decision-making, but that resulted in greater dissent and micromanagement. Senior leaders' voices weren't heard, creativity was quashed, and the atmosphere grew guarded. Disney was not faltering because it lacked talent or resources. It was faltering because creativity depends on trust, candor, and psychological safety, and those had begun to disappear. Eisner's time was slowly and painfully coming to an end. Inside that environment was Bob Iger, serving as Chief Operating Officer for the last 5 years of Eisner's tenure. Disney's board of directors began a search for Eisner's replacement. Before Iger ever made a decision in his potential for that role, he faced a perception problem. Any internal successor could be framed as continuity rather than change, familiarity rather than renewal. In that moment in Disney's history, familiarity was not reassuring. Iger understood something critical. If he tried to explain the past, he would be defined by it. So he sought advice. The person he turned to was Bill Campbell, a trusted counselor to leaders navigating succession and power transitions. Campbell's advice was simple and exacting. Do not run against Eisner. Do not criticize what came before. Do not explain what went wrong. If you frame yourself as a correction, you become part of the same story. Instead, Campbell told them to speak only about the future. When Iger went before the board, he followed that advice closely. He didn't litigate history. He didn't draw contrasts. He spoke forward. And as he spoke, he kept returning to the same 3 principles. 1, creative excellence had to be restored. 2, technology and distribution had to be embraced, not resisted. And 3, Disney needed to grow globally through great storytelling. There was no spectacle in the pitch. It worked because it was clear. The board didn't hear certainty, they heard direction. Throughout The Ride of a Lifetime, Iger distills his experiences into these 10 guiding principles. They aren't abstract ideas, they're pulled from moments where the stakes were real and the cost of failure was public and huge. We're only going to touch on a few of them here. 4 principles in particular show up again and again in the stories that follow. First, optimism is not naivete. It is a leadership responsibility. Second, clarity consistently outperforms control. Third, people matter more than processes, especially in creative organizations. And finally, storytelling is not just what Disney produces, it's how leadership works. Everything that follows can be traced back to those ideas. So as Bob Iger was appointed to be CEO, the first real test came quickly: Pixar. At the time, Pixar was not part of Disney. It was an independent animation studio whose films Disney distributed under a contract negotiated when Disney was far larger and more powerful. Now, that contract mattered. Disney financed and distributed the films. Disney owned the characters. Pixar, despite creating the stories and the technology that defined those films, received a smaller share of the value it produced. What began as a practical business arrangement hardened into resentment. The films succeeded, the relationships did not. By the time Iger became CEO, the partnership was strained and close to breaking. Pixar could walk away after fulfilling their movie obligations, and Disney Animation Studios, struggling creatively on its own, could not replace what Pixar had been delivering. Pixar was owned largely by Steve Jobs, who had a long memory and little patience for institutions that failed to treat creative talent as an equal. Under Michael Eisner, the relationship had deteriorated further, marked by mistrust, public tension, and hardening positions on both sides. From the outside, the situation looked irreparable. Many advised Iger not to pursue Pixar. The price would be enormous, jobs would be difficult, and the negotiation would require Disney to confront uncomfortable truths about how it had treated its most important creative partner. Iger chose to pursue it anyway. This was not about securing a pipeline of hit movies. It was about repairing a relationship Disney itself had damaged, and in so doing, deciding what kind of company Disney would become. Iger approached Steve Jobs differently than his predecessor had. He listened. He acknowledged the imbalance in the original deal rather than defending it, and he made a decision that would define his leadership. Disney ended up acquiring Pixar for approximately $4.5 billion. But Pixar would not be absorbed into Disney's existing creative machinery, it would be protected. Pixar's leadership would remain intact, so its creative culture would be preserved. Its way of working would not be diluted, and this was the heart of the decision. In addition, the two creative leaders of Pixar would become the head of Walt Disney Animation Studios as well. Iger understood that Pixar's success was not accidental. It was cultural, and no amount of process, oversight, or integration would improve on that. In fact, it would likely destroy it. This is people over process in action. Disney did not just buy a studio. It admitted that its future depended on trusting creatives more than controlling them. Now, the impact went beyond Pixar itself. Pixar's philosophy, standards, and creative discipline began to influence Disney Animation Studios from the inside. Story reclaimed its central place. Creative confidence returned. What looked like an acquisition on paper became a reset in practice, and it set the tone for everything that followed. The next chapter was Marvel. Marvel presented Bob Iger with a different kind of challenge. Pixar required repairing a damaged relationship. Marvel required belief. At the time Disney considered the acquisition, Marvel was not the cultural juggernaut it would later become. It had extraordinary characters and a deep catalog of intellectual property, but it lacked scale, long-term stability, and a global platform capable of fully realizing that potential. Marvel had begun to prove something important, however. With the success of Iron Man, it showed that a connected cinematic universe might be possible. But that idea was still fragile. The financial model was untested, the risk was real, and a single failure could have unraveled the entire experiment. Iger saw both the opportunity and the vulnerability. Disney brought distribution power, market reach, and global infrastructure. Marvel brought something rarer, a coherent narrative vision, and a leadership team that understood how those stories could interlock over time. Central to that vision was Kevin Feige. Feige was not simply producing individual films. He was quietly constructing a long-term story architecture that required patience, trust, and protection from short-term pressure. The Marvel Cinematic Universe depended on a willingness to delay gratification, resist interference, and let stories build. That created tension immediately. Disney was making a massive financial bet. The temptation to demand control, accelerate timelines, or optimize for short-term returns was obvious. The pressure from shareholders and analysts was constant. Iger made a deliberate choice. He chose to back the people, not override them. Rather than folding Marvel into Disney's existing creative machinery, Iger preserved Marvel Studios as a distinct operation. He supported Feige's long-term vision, and he resisted the instinct to manage storytelling by committee. This was optimism practiced as responsibility, not optimism as hope, optimism as commitment. Iger committed Disney's capital, reputation, and patience to a future that did not yet exist. He accepted that belief had come before proof. What followed reshaped modern entertainment. the Marvel Cinematic Universe became one of the most successful storytelling enterprises in history. Several Marvel films now rank amongst the highest grossing movies ever made worldwide. More importantly, the interconnected narrative model changed how studios thought about franchises, long-term planning, and audience engagement. But that outcome was not inevitable. It depended on leadership that understood something subtle but essential. Optimism is not about assuming things will work out. It is about taking responsibility for creating conditions in which they can. In Marvel's case, that meant trusting the vision, protecting the people behind it, and holding steady when the results were not yet guaranteed. Iger's next big swing was Lucasfilm. Lucasfilm tested Bob Iger in a way the other acquisitions did not. Pixar came with momentum. Marvel came with a growing cinematic engine. Lucasfilm came with legacy. There were no feature films in active development, no clear roadmap for what the next chapter of Star Wars should be. What Disney was considering acquiring was not a pipeline of content, but one of the most emotionally charged intellectual properties in the world. Star Wars was George Lucas's life's work. It wasn't just a business asset, it was personal, and it came with a fan base that was intensely loyal, deeply opinionated, and historically unforgiving of missteps. Any wrong move would not just be criticized, it would be cultural news. Iger understood the risk immediately. This was not a deal that could be managed into success. The first challenge was trust. Lucas had watched his creation take on a life of its own, and he was wary of what would happen if it fell into the hands of a large corporation. At the same time, Lucasfilm needed a future beyond its founder. The technology, the distribution landscape, and the economics of filmmaking had changed. Iger approached the conversation deliberately. He did not position Disney as a savior. He did not promise creative control from a distance. He did not treat the acquisition as a simple transfer of ownership. Instead, he framed the deal around stewardship. Disney would protect Star Wars as a storytelling universe, not exploit it as a brand. Lucas would be respected as a creator, even as the creative leadership transitioned. And decisions about the future of the franchise would be guided by clarity of direction, not micromanagement from the top. That distinction mattered. As part of the acquisition, Iger agreed to structure the transition in a way that honored Lucas's legacy while still allowing Disney to move forward. Lucas would step back from day-to-day creative control, but his voice would be heard. Disney would set expectations about scale, quality, and long-term vision, but not dictate every creative choice. This was not a comfortable balance. Iger knew that once Disney owned Lucasfilm, the pressure to control outcomes would be immense. The financial stakes were enormous, the public scrutiny constant. The temptation to manage creativity through committee would be strong. He resisted it. Instead of inserting himself into story decisions, Iger focused on hiring and empowering creative leadership. He concentrated on defining what Star Wars should stand for, rather than exactly how each story should unfold. This is where one of Iger's clearest principles shows up. Clarity beats control. He provided direction without domination. He set guardrails without scripting the journey. And he accepted that creative risk could not be eliminated, only managed with integrity. The result was not a frictionless process. Some decisions were controversial, some choices divided fans, but the franchise moved forward. Star Wars returned to theaters, new stories were told, and the universe expanded in ways that would not have been possible without that transition. The Lucasfilm acquisition reminds us of something essential about leadership. Owning something does not mean understanding it better than the people who created it. And control, when mistaken for leadership, often produces the very outcomes leaders fear most. In this case, restraint was not a lack of leadership. It was a strategy. The Ride of a Lifetime was written as Iger prepared to step away from Disney the first time. Unfortunately, the transition didn't hold. His successor, Bob Chapek, struggled mightily to maintain culture cohesion and strategic clarity. Less than a year after stepping aside in late 2020, Iger was asked to return as CEO. Not for a victory lap, for stability. As he prepares to step away again, the pattern is clear. Disney didn't regain its footing because of one bold decision. It did so because leadership returned to first principles. Optimism without denial, clarity without control, respect for people, and belief in the power of story. As is the case, we have 3 suggested actionable takeaways. Takeaway number 1, read the book, but read it with a lens. If you haven't read The Ride of a Lifetime, that's the first action. Put this on your list this week. Buy it, download it, start it. As you read, keep one question in front of you. What principle is showing up in this decision, and where do I need that principle in my own leadership right now? Underline the uncomfortable moments, not just the successful ones. That's where the real lessons often are. Takeaway 2, write down your 3 priorities for the next 12 months. Iger didn't come in with a long list of goals. He kept returning to a small set of priorities that guided every decision. This week, write down 3 priorities that will guide your leadership for the next year. Not goals, priorities. Each one should force a trade-off. If this is a yes, what becomes a no? Clarity beats control only when clarity is written down. And takeaway number 3, identify one place where control is replacing trust. Ask yourself this week, where am I over-controlling because I don't fully trust the people, the process, or the outcome? Pick one specific place. Then do one intentional thing. Delegate it clearly, set expectations, and step back. Not forever, just enough to test whether clarity and trust can do what control hasn't. The Ride of a Lifetime isn't a book about Disney trivia or deal making. It's a book about how leadership actually works when the outcomes aren't guaranteed and the cost of failure is public and immense. If you're leading people, building something creative, or trying to decide what kind of leader you want to be, this is a must read. Bob Iger said yes to acknowledge where Disney was, and he said and to the vision he built, then executed to secure Disney's future. Thank you for joining me in this Yes and Land, where we honor the real story you're living and invite you to the next chapter filled with hope, joy, and connection.